Greetings again, students. This is the video lecture for the Week 2 readings on social movement theory. This week we'll be discussing Charles Tilley's From Mobilization to Revolution, Sidney Taro's Power in Motion, McCarthy and Zold's Partial Theory of Resource Mobilization, Benford and Snow's discussion of ideological framing, and finally Gamson's defining movement success. And so again, I'll go over these individually and then kind of talk about a synthesis at the end. So we start off with Tilley in his book from 1978, From Mobilization to Revolution. And I think this is a very good foundational work when we're talking about social movements and social movement theory. And it lines out a lot of the factors that we might consider important for the formation of a social movement and for its potential success. So he talks a lot about the intersection of kind of groups, movements, and events. Groups being somewhat separate and potentially part of a movement, but potentially not part of it, and events kind of lining up with the movement or perhaps not, but these events might also provide opportunities, which is something that we talk about a lot in social movement theory, opportunity structures. And so when he discusses he talks a lot about mobilization as a key component to kind of creating a social movement, right? He talks about capacity as being another important component. So capacity and opportunity, or mobilization and opportunity, then lead to collective action. And again, he's thinking about collective action in a very broad sense, talking about violence and nonviolence and kind of across the spectrum. But how do people come together under the heading of something that they all share an interest in common and then decide to work towards that interest? So there's a brief discussion on page 101 about anti-mobilization strategies, and I find this really interesting because I think this is something that governments do either implicitly or explicitly, where they neutralize the actor as well as the action and make it less likely that the actor will be able to act rapidly when the government suddenly becomes vulnerable, a new coalition arises, etc. And so one of the ways to kind of nip a movement in the bud is to go at its ability to mobilize adequately. And that can mean a lot of different things. That can mean cutting off funding, monetary resources. It could mean trying to limit their ability to recruit people by making a group illegal, for example. It could, outlaw protest, for example, is another way to stop mobilization from taking place, or collective association, in terms of restricting the freedom of association of who you're able to talk to. And I think one of the really important parts from the Tilley reading is the analysis of collective action has 5 big components. So when we're talking about collective action, we need to talk about 5 things. The first is interests. There have to be interests involved in terms of somebody somewhere has to say, look, we want to do something about this thing. And then the next step is organization. So you need to get these people that might come from very different places that have a similar interest and organize them together. Then mobilization, which is the process by which you take this organization and get them out, get them ready to go and give them the resources they need so that they can go out and pursue the collective action. And then you need opportunity, which presents itself in many different ways. And then finally, collective action itself. And so this framework allows you to look at some of the movements or conflicts that you want to look at and maybe break it down into its constituent parts. And this is a good way for doing that. What was the interest involved? What was the organization involved? How did they mobilize? What opportunity did they take advantage of? And then finally, what collective action resulted in the end. So a couple of final points from Tilley. I had you read a lot. I think chapter 1 is the most important thing, so if you go back you need to reread for your paper or something, focusing on chapter 1 is a real good place to go. Chapter 4 shows you how dedicated and how intricate the thought behind a lot of this is. And then chapter 8 kind of wraps everything up, and it's a way to kind of conclude the book without having to read the whole thing. So that's why I assigned those different parts. But I think chapter 1 gives you the most helpful information. at the same time, it does a really good job of talking about collective action in 17th century England and talking about collective action in 18th century America and in France as well, right? So you get some kind of different examples of how collective action was organized and why it took place. But the last two major concepts from Tilley before I move on is this idea of repertoires of collective action, that in the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, food riots were very popular. When peasants weren't able to find food, then they would go into town with either moldy food or rotting fruit, as it were, and would petition redress, essentially, and would riot or come together in some form of collective action to ask the government to provide food for them. So those were very popular for about 50 or 60 years, but they died out in the 1830s. And then around that same time, you have the rise of petitions and the rise of petition marches, where a group of trade workers or skilled workers or craftsmen, whoever it may be, would come together and then march down to Parliament or the seat of government with a petition in hand and then formally present the petition for a redress of grievances, right? And so that was a repertoire. In the 1950s, the use of the sit-in became very popular. People would occupy government buildings. They would sit down at the lunch counter at Woolworths, for example. And those sit-ins became part of the repertoire of collective action. So this repertoire changes over time, but there are very similar tactics and strategies that are used by these groups, and they diffuse over time and in different places. And so nonviolent civil resistance, for example, the use of civil disobedience, the use of alternative institutions, the use of protest marches, those kinds of things, and especially what we're seeing today in the U.S. with the use of protest marches and that kind of thing, that's part of our repertoire of collective action right now. 50 years from now, protest marches may be a thing of the past, and that may no longer exist. It may be something completely different. But either way, the action that takes place at a given time and a given place is very much a result of that time and that place, but it's also a result of the things that have spread to that place and influenced it from other areas. And this is, again, where the transnational comes down and the rise of globalization becomes very important, because as globalization and transnationalism increases, then the diffusion of these tactics is increasing as well. And we can think about this in terms of violence, the use of terrorism, for example, suicide bombings, not a very popular tactic before the 1980s, a pretty popular tactic for the last 30 years now. That was something that was not utilized as often before, right? People would set bombs and then leave, so bombing was not necessarily new, but the idea of a suicide bomber was pretty rare until a certain point. In 1993, you had the first World Trade Center bombing, where they tried to drive a truck or a car. It's another repertoire. A car bomb is another repertoire. Insurgency is a repertoire of collective action. And so all of these, even violent forms that we see, are part of these repertoires that groups are learning about from other groups. And then the last point from Tilley is this idea of contentious politics. And Taro goes into this a lot further, so this makes a good segue. But contentious politics, that's the environment in which collective action takes place, right? Without contention, you have no reason for collective action to exist. If people are happy with what's going on and they're satisfied with the state of the world, then they don't need to come together and attempt to change the status quo, right? So contentious politics, according to Taro, is when collective actors join forces in confrontation with elites, authorities, and opponents around their claims or the claims of those they claim to represent. And so that's a very simple definition. There's not too much complexity to it, but it's important to keep in mind that that's contentious politics. This is the arena or environment that a lot of this movement, social movement, is taking place in. So he also goes on to talk about how when these collective actors are backed by well-structured social networks and galvanized by culturally resonant, action-oriented symbols, contentious politics leads to sustained interaction with opponents to social movements. And so again, contentious politics by itself is not enough for collective action to take place. But when you have social networks that are galvanized by culturally resonant frames and action-oriented symbols, then it can lead to sustained interaction, which then becomes a social movement, right? So we're also looking at these as, and this is the difference between a one-off event and a sustained campaign for change. Contentious politics emerges in response to changes in political opportunities and threats when participants perceive and respond to a variety of incentives. So again, we want to think about this in terms of opportunities that arise, that in certain places at certain times, things may have happened very differently. So for example, when the Nazi Party came to power in the late 1920s and early 1930s, this was very much a result of post-World War I, the Versailles Treaty, the Germans being, not being allowed to have an army or a navy, having those abilities and a lot of their economic kind of rights taken away, and being put into a very tough situation. And then that was added to by the Great Depression that started with the stock market in America, but then spread quickly to the rest of the world. And there are stories of German citizens with wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks going to the bank to buy a loaf of bread. A wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread, right? And so there was obviously a lot, people were very upset with governing structures in Germany at the time. And you couple that with the Weimar Republic and the first, open democracy in Germany, and the Nazis, the fascist party, basically had a place where they were able to voice their opinion because it was a democracy, and they had a lot of disgruntled people because of the Treaty of Versailles and the Depression. So you add all that up, and you have contentious politics, which created an opportunity. The Nazis were able to organize. They did a lot of that in bars, actually, and trade associations and that kind of thing. So they were able to organize and then mobilize and then take advantage of the opportunity that was presented them through the democracy. You have collective action. So that helps to explain how you get to see the rise of the Nazi Party. And there are plenty of other examples that we could talk about, but that's one of them. Another idea from Taro that's really important is these cycles of contention, so that these things happen in cycles. That again, with the stock market crash in 1929, created a lot of opportunities for people. People were upset because of grievances. Things were changing. Structures of government were being challenged. So this created a cycle of contention. And a lot of things were happening at the Spanish Civil War taking place at the same time. You had the Italian fascists. You had, lots of people, lots of countries and states in Europe were dealing with the rise of kind of conservative fascism. And at the same time, another example in the 1960s in the U.S. and in Western Europe, right, with the Vietnam War, with the free speech movement, with the civil rights movement before it, it was a very contentious time in American history, and there was a lot going on, protests all over the place. You had the Days of Rage in Chicago in 1970. You had hundreds, literally 400 universities across the country closed because of mass protests and some violence on college campuses across the country. AU was one of those campuses that closed. Small places like Southern Illinois University had to close. Somebody bombed the environmental sciences department or the science department down there. And so those that time period represents an era of a cycle of contention where there was a lot going on. And again, today, I think in some ways we are in a cycle of contention with the housing crisis and the repression, or the housing crisis and not the depression, but the recession that took place after the housing crisis in 2008, 2009, created an environment where things are quite contentious. And you see the rise of kind of authoritarian regimes and the rise of authoritarianism, partially as a response to this current cycle of contention that we're witnessing. So, I think a couple other minor points from Taro, and Taro's a really good foundational piece as well, and he does a good job of talking about a lot of the key elements like framing and collective action framing and that kind of stuff, a lot of key elements of social movement theory. But the most forceful argument of his study, that people engage in contentious politics when patterns of political opportunities and constraints change, and then by strategically employing a repertoire of collective action, creating new opportunities which are used by others and widening these cycles of contention. So this is an interplay. It's not one movement or one group in isolation. It's one group that might drive a wedge somewhere that creates an opportunity that another group in another place that might not even be interested in the same things as the first movement or first group can come in and take advantage of that new opportunity and widen this cycle of contention. So there's an iterative process, not just between the movement and the government that they're trying to talk to, but between movements, governments, other movements, and other places. That these things are taking place across space and time. There are usually multiple actors, multiple groups, and multiple organizations that are involved, and all of these can be acting in different ways. So it's very complex, make a long story short. He also talks about, as a minor point, that despite globalization, societies do not respond in lockstep to the same stimuli, right? So the same event might occur in different places, but different societies will react differently. And that, again, suggests that there are different mindsets or different cultural differences from one country or one society or one place to the next. And then even though the same event can technically affect all of them equally, that their responses aren't necessarily going to be the exact same across the board. And that's important, that even though globalization might lead to a rise in these shared experiences, it doesn't necessarily lead to a rise in shared reactions. And the final point from Taro is this idea that the governments are increasing their capacity, especially democratic governments are increasing their capacity to suppress some of these contentious movements, right? They're finding ways, and this suppression doesn't necessarily mean repression, although you can tell from Tilly and Taro that repression is a pretty key component of influencing people to decide to act collectively. But suppression can mean a lot of things. Suppression can mean, like we were talking about, the anti-mobilization strategy, where they may be using tools to their advantage to stop things from mobilizing in the first place. They may basically subsume the movement, right? Or find a way to bring it into itself and kind of calm the fears while at the same time not affecting any of the change. And Gamson refers to this at the end as co-optation, where the group is recognized, but they don't get the benefits that they were asking for originally. And so that's one example, and Gamson does a great job of talking about why that is, or how we define that as success or not. So moving on to McCarthy and Zoll, and this is a dense piece. They're all dense pieces, but McCarthy and Zoll is pretty dense. There's a lot going on there. What's important, I think, is that at the time, in the 1970s, in the late 60s, and moving into the 70s, people were really focusing on the kind of social psychology aspect of things and the kind of shared grievances as an explanation for why people resist. So there's a book called Why Men Rebel, written by Ted Gurr, which is an excellent book and does a really good job of talking about kind of how do grievances, shared grievances, you and I experience the same thing, that can lead to a kind of feeling of solidarity or a feeling of inclusion with somebody else. You find more people that are like that, you aggregate these people together, and all of a sudden you have a group. The group decides to get together and hold a protest or do something about it. Now you have organization, and you have mobilization, and then you have collective action. And so what they're really saying is that actually it's not just shared grievances. That doesn't explain the story. Just because there are many people across the world that have shared grievances, not all of them act collectively. So what he's saying is that on top of this social psychology, there's this other element, and that's this ability to mobilize resources. And resources for them, for their argument, comes in a lot of different forms, right? Money, power, connections, guns, or bombs if you're looking to be violent. But either way, you have to amass resources into one place to be able to utilize them against something or for something. And so they talk about resource flows and the importance of resource flows, and that's something that you'll want to keep an eye on when you're analyzing your movement or your civil conflict. Where are the resources coming from? How are people getting these resources? And as we move forward into the next couple of weeks, when we talk about insurgency, terrorism, and eventually foreign fighters, we're going to find that these resources are a pretty important part of the story, right? So Heghammer's Rise of the Muslim Foreign Fighter talks about a kind of pan-Islamic movement that helped frame things and helped get resources into certain places. And that helps to explain why you saw so many foreign fighters in Afghanistan and why you see so many foreign fighters in Syria today. So the last component from them that you might find really interesting is the discussion of social movement sector, social movement industries, and social movement organization. So the social movement organization is the actual organization, the group that has come together. The social movement industry is, the kind of umbrella under which all these organizations that have similar interests live. And then the social movement sector is where all the social movements in a given society exist, right? So in our social movement sector, there are environmental groups, there are anti-abortion right groups, there are pro-abortion right groups, there are animal rights activists, there are peace activists, anti-nuclear. All of these fit into the social movement sector. But when you narrow it down, the environmental and animal activists are probably in one industry, and the human rights and peace activists may be in a different one, and then the abortion rights activists might be in a very different one. And then each one of those has their constituent organization or individual group that exists. So you can think about it as a big umbrella, right? Social movement sector, industry, and organization. So that might help you to think about things in your paper down the road. A couple more points from McCarthy and Zald that he defines social movement in there as a set of opinions and beliefs in a population to which which represents preferences for changing some tenets of the social structure and or reward distribution of a society. So Tilly has his definition of a kind of a collective action. Taro has his definition. McCarthy and Zald have their definition. So use the definition that works for you. There's not one that's right and one that's wrong. But the point here is that there are lots of different places to get these definitions, and you need to use the ones that are going to be most helpful to you. So moving on, Benford and Snow talk about framing, and especially collective action frame. So framing is this verb, this way to describe active and processual phenomena that implies agency and contention at the level of reality construction. So when you frame something, you're saying, I believe it is this. And so there's important things. There's the I, that's the agency part, and there's the I believe it's this. And it's contentious because you don't have to say I believe it's this if what you believe lines up with what everybody else is saying. So it's automatically contentious to frame something a certain way. And then you get to collective action frames, which are intended to mobilize potential adherents and constituents to garner bystander support and to demobilize antagonists. So you want to get the people that already are on your side to get out and commit more action or do more things. You want to get people that aren't on your side, that are kind of fence sitters in the middle, to come over to your side. And you want to get people that are against you to stop being against you. You might move them to be fence setters, or you might want to move them to be part of your group. But either way, you're trying to get the opponents to settle down, your adversaries to settle down. And these collective action frames are action-oriented sets of beliefs and meanings that inspire and legitimate activities and campaigns of social movement organizations. So they inspire things to happen and legitimate activities. So they say, this is why we're doing it, and we need to do it this way, right? So when you look at ICE, the Islamic State's framing of certain things, or Al-Qaeda's framing of things, it's very important how they pit it as a war against Islam, as they pit it as a war against the West, and how their way of life is being destroyed or is in danger of being destroyed, and that they need help from other people from outside their group, maybe not outside the Muslim group, but from outside their state or where the individuals are located, to come to them and help out, right? So it's meant to mobilize. It's action-oriented. That's very important. And then finally, that this outcome is the collective action frame is an outcome of negotiated shared meaning. So it's not necessarily just what one person says. That one person can say something, somebody else can disagree. And once you get to a point where a lot of the parties that are disagreeing can agree, it becomes something that will apply and appeal to a much broader audience, right? So shared meaning, meant to mobilize, action-oriented, demobilize antagonists, convince bystanders. These are important ways to think about framing. And that's some of the big points from Benford and Snow. And then finally we get to Gamson, which is a very short piece on kind of how do we define movement success. This is something that a lot of people gloss over, and we need to talk about a lot more. What makes a terrorist group successful? What makes an insurgency successful? How do we measure that? And one of the ways that he talks about it is, there are two basic categories, one concerned with the fate of the group, and then one with the distribution of new advantages to the group's beneficiaries. So the central issue in the first category is acceptance of the challenging group. Can they be accepted by antagonists as a valid spokesman for a legitimate set of interests? And the central issue in the second is whether or not the group's beneficiary gains new advantages during the challenge and its aftermath. So again, that's a very kind of brief introduction or brief way of thinking about success, but it can be very helpful. Has ISIS or has the Islamic State been successful? I think in some ways they have. In other ways they haven't. And if the group continues to get smaller and smaller and eventually is destroyed or disbanded or whatever, then obviously that acceptance isn't there. But maybe it results in greater protection for minorities in Syria, in which case it was successful because that was originally their plan. Maybe they get disbanded, but Assad winds up leaving power. And if that happens, then again, they don't get the longevity, they're not around, but what they were calling for, which is the removal of Assad, was accomplished. And another one that I throw in there is this idea of legacy, right? That even if the Islamic State is disbanded and Assad doesn't leave power, do they create a legacy that future groups will be able to use? Will another group down the road be able to look at what the Islamic State did and say, we are like these guys. We're gonna take territory. We're gonna control territory. We're gonna create create the new caliphate. And again, that frame, we're going to create a new caliphate, is not new. That's something that they adopted from people that came before them, and those people adopted from people that came before them, and so on and so forth. And so I think another way to think about success is in terms of legacy. It's a lot more squishy. It's not as hard, and it's harder to measure what the legacy of a group is. But, again, Al-Qaeda, even though they've kind of been beaten down over the last 15 or 16 years, leaves a pretty large legacy for people that want to undertake similar actions in the future. So regardless of their success in the immediate future, they might wind up being tremendously successful down the road. And next week we're going to read Bruce Hoffman's Inside Terrorism, and he's going to talk about, the role of various terrorist groups and organizations throughout history and how these groups influence each other. And so again, this is part of a much larger puzzle, a much larger picture that goes back a long, long time, and people are picking and choosing things from the past and saying, oh, this works for us, and then moving it forward and bringing it forward into the present. So, all that being said, I think throughout the lecture I kind of was able to tie things together, so I won't go too much into depth in it. But the key thing to remember about these readings, and this was a lot of readings for this week, and I apologize a little bit for that, but at the same time, this is your toolkit for moving forward and writing the paper. This is where you're going to use the tools from these readings: political opportunity structures, mobilization, grievances, ideological framing, success. You're going to look at repertoires of contention, cycles of contention. You're going to look at those tools and use those to analyze your group or movement in the paper. So there's a lot going on here, but the reason for it is to give you a big toolkit to be able to use those moving forward. And not just for this paper, but hopefully for thinking about things in other classes and other ways as well. So that's my hope for this week. Again, I know there was a lot of reading, and sometimes it felt a little tangential to what we're going to get into. But again, this is kind of getting your toolkit together before you go in and do the hard work for the day. And so, as I said, I hope you were able to get a lot out of it, found some of this stuff interesting. This is definitely a way of thinking about things that's usually contained to the kind of nonviolent sphere. But we're going to see in the next couple of weeks how some of these concepts have been translated into the study of political violence in the form of insurgency and terrorism next week, and then later with specifically foreign fighters and how the foreign fighter phenomena came about, what its results have been, and really we're going to start digging into the specifics in the next couple weeks. So this is a lot of the concepts, a lot of the theory, a lot of the ideas that are going to help fuel your analysis for the final paper. So I hope you got a lot out of the readings, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and other than that, I will see you next week. Everybody have a great day.